Series 4 of the 50 Faces podcast is sponsored by Baillie Gifford. Baillie Gifford is a long-term investment manager dedicated to discovering the innovations and change makers that deliver exceptional growth opportunities for its clients.
The good news. And the good news is that in the last, I would say, 30 years, the region has done a lot of macro and micro economic reforms, many countries. Of course, Chile was probably the best well-known under this Chicago boys influence, but actually many countries in the region copied some of these reforms.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to this 50 Faces podcast live. I'm joined today in person in Santiago by Jose Manuel Silva, who is Chief Investment Officer and Managing Partner at LarrainVial Asset Management in Santiago. He has worked in finance for most of his career. Welcome, Jose Manuel. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Aoife. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for traveling very far to the end of the world to meet with us here at LarrainVial.
Well, I came across your podcast with Bloomberg and Marin Talks Money, found that absolutely fascinating, listened to it 3 times. And I wouldn't want to repeat necessarily all of what was there, but would love to build on it. I will put the link to that podcast in the show notes and also take it from that point onwards and look a little bit at the current situation around markets in Chile. But before that, as is typical in 50 Faces, we'll start with your background. And I'd love to hear where you were born, what you studied, and how you came to enter the world of investment.
Yeah, okay. I was born in Montevideo, Uruguay, because my father was a diplomat. He was a Chilean diplomat. So he was ambassador in Montevideo when I was born. Then I lived for many years in Europe also. I was in school, in my high school in Geneva and Ottawa in Canada, in French schools. And then I came back to Chile to study economics and business at Catholic University in Santiago, which is considered probably one of the best universities in Latin America, and especially the business school and the economic school of Catholic University in Santiago, where the famous Chicago boys transformed an accounting faculty during the 50s in a modern business and economics faculty in the 70s and 80s. So I studied there. And then I began working with a fascinating man called Jose Piñera. That was late 80s. He had a free market magazine, which was very influential in the what we call the Battle of Ideas in Santiago, defending the free market reforms that the military government was doing and defending also a peaceful transition to democracy. And then I also worked as a business journalist at El Mercurio, which is the main newspaper in Santiago. I worked there for a year and a half. But after that, I decided that I wanted to do a career in finance. So I worked at Banques Trust in Santiago, Citicorp in Santiago, and I ended up working at LarrainVial, first as a head of research of the sell-side research department of LarrainVial Investment Bank. LarrainVial is a family-owned investment bank in Chile, 90 years old. And so we are very strong in brokerage. That was the origin of LarrainVial. And so we have a very strong research department in the brokerage unit, which I headed. That was my first job in LarrainVial. And after 6 years as head of the research department, Fernando Larraín, who is the CEO and grandson of the founder of LarrainVial, he asked me if I could come here to asset management. And I became the CIO of the asset management division of LarrainVial. During those years, we were managing close to $801 billion. Today, we are managing close to $8 billion.
Quickly, before we move on to discuss market conditions, I always like to look in someone's past and ask what they bring from that into their role today. So spending time as a journalist, how do you think that affected your mindset as an investor?
Perhaps 2 things, I would say. First, of course, is the importance of communications. I think that in the modern world, communications are very, very important. And to try to explain what you are doing to your clients and to explain it in a, I would say, easy way, because not using the financial jargon, which many times becomes too complicated and too difficult for a normal investor, for a person that is saving for his, to buy a house in a few years, etc. So we have a lot of retail clients. LarrainVial also is one of the largest private banking groups in Chile, but we have a lot of different clients, and not all of them are are financial specialists. So we try to communicate with them and to explain to them what we are doing and to explain to them when we commit errors and when we do it correctly. So that's one issue. The other thing is that more than as a journalist, that having been the son of a diplomat, that has allowed me to know that there is a very wide world. I have the chance to learn French and to learn English during my son of diplomat years. And that allows me to read a lot of things. I love to read newspapers and business magazines from all over the world. So I spend a lot of personal money and, being a subscriber to Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Nikkei Asia, Le Point from France. So that has helped us, for instance, that has helped us here at LarrainVial Asset Management to try to have a more broader view of markets, of the influence of international macroeconomic trends in Chile. Chile is a small country in a very big world. And so we are very much influenced by what's happening abroad. We are a commodities exporter. And of course, as a commodity exporters, we are very much influenced by what's happening in Asia, especially in China. For instance, Chile is the largest copper producer in the world. And today, the largest consumer of copper in the world is China, by far. So we try to study a lot what's happening in China, what's happening in the US. Those are the two main influences in Chile. But since also we invest a lot in Latin America, we have around $2 billion in LATAM equities invested from here. And since also macroeconomic trends are very influential in Latin American assets, we try to study a lot what's happening in Mexico, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Peru from here. But since I think we have very good economists in Chile, many of them trained at Catholic University, I think we have a good analysis of what's happening in the region.
That's, I think, part of what I'd like to get into is what do we, who are not in Chile, just look at the outside looking in, what do we maybe underappreciate or overlook when it comes to what's actually going on the ground, not only here, but in other Latin American countries? And just to give a sample, in the Bloomberg podcast, you spoke about the relatively low levels of debt to GDP. There you cited Chile at 40%, Mexico 50%, Peru 35%. So quite low compared to numbers we're seeing in the US. You mentioned the strength in commodities, monetizing those commodities, increase in high-end manufacturing activities, and then local debt issuance, just among some areas. But what would you say are the key factors that it's important to be on the ground to understand?
Well, first that, of course, probably when you are an international investor and you do not live in Latin America, you only read the bad news and the political instability and inflation, etc. And you seldom read, because it doesn't sell a lot, probably, the good news. And the good news is that in the last, I would say, 30 years, the region has done a lot of macro and microeconomic reforms, many countries. Of course, Chile was probably the best well-known under this Chicago boys influence. But actually, many countries in the region copied some of these reforms. Chile opened its economy to be much more integrated to the world in terms of opening its markets, of allowing imports from all over the world coming to Chile. Peru has done something very similar. So you have a lot of new industries that have developed exporting to the world, not only copper mining. Copper mining used to represent 90% of Chilean exports in the 70s. And now they represent around no more than 50%, even if copper production has been multiplied by 7 or 8 in physical terms. And also copper has become a very key metal for energy transition and now for AI. So even with copper prices ahead, Chile has been allowed, because of the reforms it did during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, to diversify export base. And Peru has done something very similar. Mexico also did something similar when they signed their NAFTA agreement. And so they became much more integrated to the US economy. So for instance, now Mexico is a huge exporter of cars and car parts to the United States. Mexico has a very strong industrial base in El Bajío, in the central Mexico, but also in the northern part of Mexico, where you have a lot of plants that export to the US, and then they re-import from the US and they re-export from the US. So there's a big challenge there, what will happen with the tariffs, But Mexico has developed a very strong industrial base. exporting to the US and to Canada and also exporting to Latin America. Chile has a free trade agreement with Mexico, and Mexico has free trade agreements with many Latin American countries. And then, of course, you have Brazil, which is a giant by itself. Brazil is a $220 million inhabitants country with a huge GDP, with a huge internal market. And the Brazilians depend a lot on their internal market. But in the meantime, in the last 30 years, Brazil has become first an agro-industrial powerhouse. So it's the largest exporter in the world of soybeans, one of the largest exporters of meat in the world, one of the largest exporters of sugarcane, of coffee, of orange juice. So it's really Brazil. It's an incredible agro-industrial powerhouse. But also, in the last 15 years, Brazil has become an oil powerhouse. Today, Brazil is the largest oil exporter in Latin America. So they had surpassed Mexico because of the partial privatization of the oil sector in Brazil. So Brazil is also a country that has reformed somewhat its economy in the last 25 years from the Cardoso government on. So now they have an independent central bank, which is something that happens all over the region. So central banks became much more independent, much more orthodox. That has allowed inflation to be under control, which was not the case always in Latin America. The only country where we have inflation not under control was Argentina until a few months ago. And the Milei government is doing its job, and they're bringing inflation down quite dramatically. We'll see what happens next in Argentina, but at least they're doing that. But now we have independent central banks or quasi-independent central banks in Mexico, in Peru, in Colombia, in Chile, in Brazil. And inflation in all those countries is quite low for historical standards in Latin America. Then in the case of Brazil, Brazil also privatized a lot of companies during the 90s. And they're still privatizing companies. They're also privatizing partially part of the public works, highways, which is something that also Chile pioneered. So in Chile, you have an incredible network of highways, toll-paying highways. Those highways were financed in Chile by issuing bonds in the local market, and those bonds were bought by the local pension funds. So that's another trend which has, I would say, characterized Latin America in the last 25 years, is the creation of local institutional investors, mostly pension funds, but not only pension funds. And that has allowed the region, for the first time in history, to have the availability of long-term funds in local currency. And that helps the governments, but also helps local blue chips, which finance themselves in the local bond markets. That's happening very strongly in Chile, in Peru, Colombia, Mexico. Those four countries have partially privatized the social security system through a private accounts system, which is accumulating a lot of money. The pension funds now in Mexico have around $320 billion. In Chile, they have around $200 billion. In Peru, they have around 30-something billion dollars. And in Colombia, they have around $100 billion. And in Brazil, even if you do not have this system, there's a lot of local institutional investors that manage a good amount of money. So this is changing the capital markets of the region. This has been changing a lot. That has allowed, for instance, the emergence of IPOs. There's a lot of new companies entering the market in the last 25 years, new sectors. That has allowed also the issuance of bonds, long-term bonds, 10-year bonds, 15-year bonds, 20-year bonds. In the case of Chile, for instance, the local pension funds has allowed for the first time in the last 20 years, for the first time, the Chilean middle class has access to mortgages, 25-year mortgages, 30-year mortgages. That was completely in existence in Latin America 30 years ago. So all of these reforms have allowed the Latin American and the Chilean economy and the Latin American economies to grow faster, especially Chile, Peru, Colombia in the past. And probably those changes are very little known outside the region.
That's so interesting. And I think on the question of geopolitical risk that's perceived, and you will maybe get an insight into this with your connection with your Edinburgh-based, the company which you have a stake. I suppose some of the perceptions, and it's interesting you brought up central bank independence, because that maybe was considered a given in Western democracies, and now that's very much under threat or under question mark in the US. So how much can these norms be sacrosanct? I suppose that might be a question that external investors might ask. The question of, you mentioned the privatization. They might ask about, there is some governments as they become more left-leaning, there could be a question, will there be renationalization, I suppose? And is that a threat to shareholder protection? How do you find the international investor understands risk around Latin America? And what would you say to some of those risks they might bring up?
Well, I think that it's true that the region has always the risk of going back. One of the problems of the having a region is that we still have left-wing parties that believe that Cuba is a paradise. For instance, in the case of Chile, one of the presidential candidates for the presidential elections, which will happen at the end of the year, is a lady that was a former labor minister of this government, the current government in Chile, which is I would say, a left-wing government. And she belongs to the Chilean Communist Party. And the Chilean Communist Party is still a very orthodox. They still believe that it's a pity that the Berlin Wall fell. And it's a pity that communism is controlling half of the world. So that's a risk. But on the other hand, a few years ago, we had a referendum in Chile where this same left-wing government proposed to the Chilean population a new constitution, which was a very left-wing constitution. Actually, The Economist magazine described that proposal as one of the wokest constitutions ever written. And 62% of the Chileans said, no, we don't want that. So if democracy is preserved, if people are allowed to vote, which is not always the case in the region, because probably you do not have free elections in Venezuela or in Cuba. But in the rest of the region, democracy, I would say, is quite well entrenched with ups and downs, as in many parts of the world. The liberal democratic framework is under attack everywhere. But if people are allowed to vote, in general, people vote quite well in the sense that they do not want to have extremes. In the case of Latin America, for instance, I think what is exerting a lot of influence is the huge amount of Venezuelan immigrants that we have now in Chile, in Peru, in Colombia. And when those immigrants speak with their friends, we have around close to 1 million Venezuelan immigrants in Chile. For a population of 20 million people, it's a lot. Actually, now everywhere when you go to a restaurant, you can hear the Venezuelan accent, the Caribbean accent. It's very different from the Chilean accent. So you know when someone comes from Venezuela. And when you speak with them, they can tell you that the Chavez and now Maduro regimes have ruined probably what was the wealthiest country in the region. Venezuela sits over a lake of oil. Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. Of course, in many countries in Latin America, that oil wealth was not always well managed. It was partially stolen by elites, which took that money out. And of course, that helped the arrival of someone like Chavez, who was a strong military guy who tried to do a coup. He was in jail and then he was pardoned and he won a democratic election, but he won and he said that he was a sort of a social democrat that wanted to change a few things. And really he was, I guess, an agent from Cuba. But in the rest of the region, I would say that democracy is very well entrenched. We can see what's happening in Argentina. Argentina, a guy like Javier Milei, who's a very strong free market politician, was elected because there's a large majority of Argentinians that are really fed up with what has happened in Argentina of the last 70 years, since General Perón created a very statist sort of capitalism where unions control the country, with monopolistic unions control a lot of things. And since then, the Argentinian economy has been always come down and down and down. And suddenly there is an uproar in the Argentinian society that said, we don't want this anymore. We'll see what happens next, because these reforms are very difficult to do, because there is a lot of entrenched interests in people that live from government jobs, but they're doing interesting reforms, and that's under democratic rule. So I would say that Latin America has its risks, but on the other hand, too, it has many assets, wealth assets, like an incredibly wealthy endowment of commodities, but also human capital wealth. So education, university education is quite good in many countries. You had a lot of well-educated professionals in many type of professions. In Chile, you can find very good quality doctors, engineers, economists, lawyers. Most of them have graduate studies in the US or in Europe. So you have good human capital. And so I think the region is always trading at a discount. And now I would say at a huge discount from developed countries, especially the US. So part of the risk is in the prices.
Thank you to Baillie Gifford for sponsoring Series 4 of the 2025 50 Faces podcast. I sat down with Matthew Coyle, Client Relationship Director at Baillie Gifford, and asked him whether he was excited about the opportunity set in global equities today.
Yeah, very much so. There's a lot to be excited about. I think the way that we look at our investment opportunity set is really to think about human nature. It's constantly evolving, and it's that innovation that we thrive on when it comes to bottom up stock picking. Great growth companies come in different forms, and we see opportunities spanning from space exploration to infrastructure projects. We're also excited about the opportunities in emerging markets. I think more recently we've seen some trading partnerships reduce and others expand, and this creates opportunities for active stock pickers like us.
And now back to the show. And that brings me to my last question on markets before we go to some personal reflections. So clearly, we've been speaking a lot about the US and its economic trajectory. And now we have this unprecedented tariff trade war, copper prices being under the spotlight. Certainly when it comes to Latin America, Brazil seems to be a target given some of its perhaps even political and judicial actions there coming under higher tariffs. How would you say Latin America, and maybe Chile in particular, are dealing with this shift in the US trade policy, foreign policy, and how do you think that is affecting the region?
Well, probably it means that everybody's worried because at the end of the day, always the US was the example of free market. And to do these free market reforms that the region has done in the last 25 years, 30 years has been very hard, very difficult. So now we have the doubt if this example of what's happening in the US could eventually jeopardize all this effort of decades and efforts which are still going on. You know, as I mentioned, for instance, Brazil is still privatizing companies. Argentina wants to privatize companies. Chile wants to keep its very advanced auctions in highways. And so there is a doubt. But on the other hand, my guess is that the US needs Latin America because there is a probability that the world will divide itself in blocks. The US government speaks a lot about the Western Hemisphere, and the Western Hemisphere includes Latin America. So the US needs Chile's copper, Chile's lithium, Peru's copper. Even in Chile, we have a project of rare earth down south. So we discovered, actually it was a LarrainVial fund, a mining fund of LarrainVial that discovered rare earths down south in Chile. It has been difficult to get that project up because Chile in the last 10 years has become a country with a lot of permits. We have lost somewhat our free market punch. But anyway, we have rare earths. There are rare earths also in Brazil. I would say that the US industry needs part of the auto parts and industrial parts that are built in Mexico and eventually in Brazil. As I mentioned in Marin's podcast, Brazil has a very sophisticated industry. They export planes. Embraer is exporting planes, and you can see many of those planes in the US airports. So really, I guess that the US needs Latin America. And sooner rather than later, I would say that the US elite will realize that. And of course, that they are worried about the Chinese and Russian influence in the region. So if they want to get that influence under control, they need to integrate more with Latin America. So my guess is that the US, after the rhetoric, will realize that to have good economic and financial relations with the region is a key element for the US to, in a way, become a more independent country from Asia, if they want to do that,
And that's interesting. You mentioned the diversification of exports to Chile, for example. Copper is no longer its largest export. How about diversification in terms of the countries to which it exports? How much is Chile reliant on the US?
Actually, the main export partner of Chile is China. Most of the copper exports go to China, but also most of the agro-industrial exports. Chile also has become sort of an agro-industrial powerhouse in the last 50 years. Chile is one of the largest exporters in the world of grapes, of cherries, of wine. And many of those exports go to the US, go to Europe. But actually, this is very funny because before the economic reforms that Chile began in the 70s, first, copper represented 90% of exports. And most of those exports went to the US. After these reforms, the US does not represent more than 25% of Chilean exports. And copper do not represent more than 50% of total exports. So the reforms allowed Chile to become a much more resilient economy. And we have a very, very well diversified exporting network. So we export a lot of the US, but we export a lot of Europe. We export a lot to Asia, and even we export a lot to countries like Brazil and Mexico. So we have a free trade agreement with practically all the world. So we have free trade agreement with the US, with Canada, with Mexico, with China.
What is at the forefront of your mind today as CIO? Thinking about new products you're developing at LarrainVial, and how about the culture at the firm as well? What kind of a culture are you trying to create?
We are specialists in Latin America. So we have Luxembourg-based CCAVs that invest in LATAM equities, in LATAM fixed income, local currency, and also hard currency. So we have also a fund that invests in credit, in bonds that are issued in dollar-denominated bonds issued by Latin American blue chips. And we are a 100-person unit, the last LarrainVial Asset Management. And also we are partners in LarrainVial Asset Management with a very large Chilean company called Consorcio Financiero. Consorcio Financiero is the owner of the largest life insurance company in Chile. So all their products that link life insurance with savings are managed by us here at LarrainVial Asset Management. Around $1 billion of money from Consorcio is managed by us here. And around $2 billion in LATAM equities is also managed from here, from this floor in the Titanium building in Santiago. This is the second tallest building in Santiago and one of the tallest buildings in Latin America. From here, we manage our CCAVs, our Luxembourg-based CCAVs. So we have a very strong team of PMs and analysts from here. And from here also, we have a 25% stake in a company in Edinburgh called Aubrey. Aubrey is a specialist in emerging markets, and they are really specialists in Asian emerging markets. And we are helping them complement their knowledge in Asia with our knowledge in Latin America. So I think we are building a very strong team with our partners in Edinburgh from Aubrey. We also have a lot of assets in Chilean fixed income because most of our clients have a portion of their assets in plain vanilla Chilean fixed income. Actually, Chilean fixed income has an interesting characteristic is that because of inflation, Chile created many, many years ago a second currency called UF, Unidad de Fomento, which is every month the UF adjusted by the CPI of the previous month. So in Chile, many things are expressed in UF, among other things, your mortgage. And many times you send your kids to a private school. Also, the private tuition is expressed in UF. So everything is kept controlled, protected from inflation. Most of the savings that are in the local pension funds are in UF. So when a company in Chile issues a bond in the local capital markets, most of those bonds are UF linked. So they are protected from inflation. Most of the bonds also issued by the government in Chile are UF linked, so protected from inflation. So that helps the savers to be protected. Even if Chile's inflation in general in the last 35 years, actually since the central bank became independent at the end of the 80s, that was the last reform by the military government, was the independence of the central bank. Since then, inflation has been always coming down and being very controlled between 3-4%. Actually, the target by the central bank is between 2 and 3. We had a blip now with COVID and all the fiscal policies that the Chilean government tried to do to avoid a very strong downturn during COVID. So that's what happened in many countries in the world. We had an inflation blip, but now it's coming down. So now, once again, we are around between 3 and 4% inflation. But in spite of that, we have kept this UF currency to allow savers to have a long-term view. So that helps a lot of our clients, to be protected from inflation. So most of our Chilean fixed income funds invest in these bonds, which are UF linked. So in a way, they adjust every month from the CPI of the previous month. For us, we are an asset manager. This, as I mentioned before, LarrainVial is an investment bank, but I am a partner in the asset management division. And so we strongly believe that asset management companies are very persons intensive. So we try to build good quality investment teams from the very early life of our professional young people that we hired. And we try to keep them in-house for many years. Sometimes we try to send them study abroad. So we have several MBAs here that went to the US mostly, some of them also in Spain. They're studying in IESE, in Barcelona, or in London, the London Business School. So we send them, we bring them back. First, we like team building. We think that to invest in the modern world is very difficult. So you need a lot of eyes looking at portfolios and good quality eyes. We also feel that teams that have people from different angles, that have studied in different type of high schools or different type of countries, are very important. So we try here to have a very multicultural or multi-country type of framework. And we also have a view that it's very important to study the fundamentals of assets. And so we build very detailed cash flow analysis of companies, either to invest in local bonds or in corporate bonds or equities. So we have a bunch of analysts here traveling all over the region. And in a way, being in a very small country in the region, because Chile is not one of the largest countries, we try to avoid the typical home bias that Mexicans and Brazilians and Argentinians have with their own market. Because at the end of the day, if you want to build a LATAM portfolio from Santiago, the Chilean equities will never represent more than 8, 9, 10% of the portfolio. And in the case of a bond portfolio, it's the same thing. So you will be obliged to deeply study what's happening in Mexico, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Peru, in Colombia. Additionally, also, we try also to have a good team of macroeconomists in-house, because macroeconomic cycles are very relevant in our region. And probably they're more relevant than in other regions of the world. So we try to follow what is the monetary cycle, the fiscal cycle very strongly, and also what are the cycles that are happening in the main business partners of the region, which are mostly the US and China. And also, since the LarrainVial is a family-owned business, but with a strong partnership of partners also, we try to invest like a boutique. We are not a large institutional investor. And we think that boutiques many times have a better performance than the larger, more bureaucratic asset managers, because we tend to price a lot independent thinking. And so we try to encourage a lot of independent thinking in our PMs and in our analysts. So we have investment committees that, in a way, try to enhance the capacity of independent thinking of all these young people. And in Chile, and in the region in general, but in Chile, in Peru, you have good universities that every year produce very high quality analysts. And we have the proof of that is that when we send these young kids, now they're kids for me, studying abroad, either to the US, the best universities in the US or the best universities in Europe, they tend to perform very well during their studies. So this is because I think we choose high quality people, but also because our universities tend to teach them very well too.
And speaking of that kind of innovation and that independent thinking, What would you say, looking to the next 5 years, how do you see the product range evolving? What will become more or less important?
Yes, one of the things we're trying to develop, and we'll see, in the past, we were pioneers in Chile in developing CCAVs in Luxembourg. So we were the first Chilean company to have CCAVs in Luxembourg under our own brand. And for us, it was a big challenge, 10 years, 12 years ago when we launched our first CCAV there. And now we are exploring the possibility to have ETFs in the US. We would love to reach the US market with a family of LATAM-based and LATAM assets ETFs, actively managed, because these would be active ETFs. We have a very strong quant team too here. Our equities team, I would say, is the mix of a very strong fundamental team and a very strong quant team. And the mix of those two styles have produced very good results. And we love to package that special type of style in an ETF to be allowed to reach the US market, because with CCAVs, it's impossible to reach the US market. And sometimes we have been approached by US investors that ask us how we could invest in your funds. And of course, they cannot invest in CCAVs. And so we are exploring the possibility to launch ETFs of the same type of products we have in Luxembourg, but under the ETF umbrella.
And just finally, then, you mentioned corporate debt being quite exciting, US dollar denominated corporate debt. I know we've talked about that in the Spanish podcast, but anything you'd like to say about how you think that market will grow?
Well, LATAM corporates, good quality corporates, need to issue in dollar denominated bonds. Even if in the last 10, 15 years, there has been a development in local markets, in local currencies, they still need to issue to diversify their financial sources of funds. They still need to issue in dollar-denominated bonds. And those portfolios, when they are well diversified, when you have a good group of analysts, trying to avoid defaults, tend to yield very good, very well. Those portfolio of good quality corporate bonds in Latin America today yield between 7-8% in dollar, but with a low correlation with US assets. So probably one of the challenges we have in the future is to try to convince US investors and world investors to discover this asset class, which is good quality corporate bonds that issue in dollar-denominated bonds. And as I mentioned before, we have a fund like that in our CCAV. And if you see the story of that fund and the story of that asset class, which has a 25-year story, is very interesting for any investor in the world, but especially for the investors from developed markets where yields are lower, but additionally where this type of asset can allow them to diversify their own markets. With a Trans-Pacific agreement, we have a free trade agreement with Europe. So Chile has a very diversified exported base, but of course, China is our main client in this moment.
I'd love to now move to some reflections. So you've used the word resilience to discuss the Chilean economy. How about your own career? Were there ups and downs? We've charted the course of a changing economy that was probably the backdrop to much of your career. Any highs or lows or kind of lessons learned that you've internalized over that time?
Well, I would say I've been very lucky, but among other things, because I was born and I became a professional when Chilean economy was beginning to grow a lot. That opened a lot of opportunities to many people in Chile. It created a new middle class that was practically inexistent before. And also it created the possibility to work in finance, in asset management. Before, when I was studying at university, asset management industry was practically non-existent in Chile. So now we have pension funds that manage close to $200 billion, life insurance companies that manage close to $80 billion, mutual funds that manage close to $100 billion, because the country became wealthier and also more open, with regulations that are similar to what you will find in a developed country. And for my career in finance, that was very helpful. But of course, what I have realized during my career is that you have cycles, that cycles are important, especially for a small open economy like Chile, which depends on commodity prices. Cycles are hugely important. And to be aware of those cycles, to be aware that those cycles happen and it can hit you very hard. For instance, the Asian crisis hit Chile very hard, at the beginning of the 21st century, at the end of 98, 99. Then you had the global financial crisis, of course, hit us quite strongly, even if Chile was quite resilient, among other things, because we had a very good banking regulation, which was enacted during the 80s average after a huge banking crisis that we had in 82, 83. So after that, Chile enacted a new banking regulation, which probably was more robust than what you had in the US before the great financial crisis. And then, of course, what we have realized in the last, I would say, 10 years is that also politics matter, that policies are not neutral, because Chile in the last 10 years probably have lost a bit its faith in free market economics. And so Chile has lost some steam in its growing momentum. We have much more regulations when you want to do a mining project, or as I mentioned before, we have these rare earth projects in the south, which has been stopped by very, I would say, bureaucratic regulations. So now the big challenge of the country and of the region is that to enact regulations that protect the climate, but without hurting growth. Because at the end of the day, Chile is still a middle-class country with a lot of poor people whose net wealth or whose future depends on growth, because growth creates jobs and jobs creates opportunities.
That's the balance, of course, that all sustainable policies need to bear in mind. Any key people who have influenced you through the course of your career or life that you can mention?
Well, one person that influenced me a lot was my first boss, who was a very well-known Chilean economist called Jose Piñera. This is a guy that he was a PhD at Harvard Economics at the age of 24, and he became one of the youngest ministers during the military government. And he did a lot of key reforms, which have been the pillars of Chile's growth of the last 40 years. Among other things, there's the privatization of Social Security and labor reforms and mining reforms. And he, of course, he was a boss, but also he was a teacher. He taught me, among other things, to read the financial press in the world. He taught me how to read The Economist, how to read the Financial Times. That was very important to be very well informed. He taught me about the importance of free market reforms and how they were done, thinking a lot about the future of Chile. So he was very influential. Of course, also for me, I had a very good economic teachers at Catholic University. Many of them were PhDs from Chicago University. So they taught us to think to think the financial and economic problems on a very professional and very rational way, to analyze problems with the modern tools of economics and finance very rationally. And then, of course, I would say what has influenced me a lot is my family. My wife, she's a lawyer. And of course, she has been very influential in all of my life. I have 7 kids, so I have a big family. And of course, to build a big family, it's crucial to have a good partner, to do that. That's a business enterprise in its own to raise 7 kids. So she is also very influential in my lifetime. She's also a lawyer, so she always helps me to analyze a lot of things under a legal, I would say, perspective. Chile is a very legalistic country since always. Since the 19th century, when Chile became one of the more institutionalized countries in Latin America, we were very lucky about that, in the 30s of the 19th century. But since then, Chile has been a very, very legalistic, very constitutional type of country. And so to have a wife that explains to you the laws is very important too.
I can imagine that's a very good discipline to have on the home front. And my last question is around any key creed or motto that you live by, or any words of wisdom, maybe that you would give to your younger self, that young journalist about to enter the world of finance, or just that defines how you approach life.
Well, for me, for instance, it was very important to read Warren Buffett letters to his investors. I would say those Warren Buffett letters are crucial, and I always try to show them to my kids, especially if they manifest interest in finance. I think there is a lot of wisdom in those letters, and all the value investing sort of school has a huge wisdom. And I try to read a lot about that. And that has helped me a lot as an investor to analyze cycles, to analyze good quality companies, to try to find good quality companies in our portfolios. So really, I would say that's a huge wisdom. And then, of course, reading history, even if I value a lot what I was taught at Catholic University about economics and finance, which was very mathematical and very rational. I am a historian by heart. And to read a lot of history, to know about economic history and financial history, I think is hugely important for someone that wants to invest and want to have a career in investments.
Well, thank you so much, Jose Manuel. That doesn't surprise me at all that you mentioned history, as I think you have woven together so instantly the historical, social, and economic context of here being in Chile and its position in the world today. Thank you for the warm welcome in Santiago and for sharing your insights here with us. And I should note as well that you will be our inaugural guest on our Spanish language version of the podcast. And that is something I'm extremely excited about. To reach a broader audience, thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you very much for coming here.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all of our content on the 50 Faces Hub, where you'll find a library of role models, resources, and other solutions to enhance your career. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.